The year is 1943. A young German auxiliary named Greta steps off a Liberty ship at the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia. Her hands shackled, her uniform torn and dirty from weeks of ocean travel. She had never seen anything quite like America before. But what would shock her most wasn't the towering skylines or the bustling ports. It was something far simpler, yet revolutionary to her wartime weary eyes. The promise of a hot shower, clean clothes, and decent food every single day. This is the story of how the most basic human needs became symbols of two vastly different worlds during the Second World War. A tale where soap and hot water told the story of a nation's abundance against another's desperate scarcity, where the simple act of bathing became a bridge between enemies, and where hygiene revealed the true cost of total war. But first, we need to correct a common misconception. The reality is that there were virtually no female German prisoners of war held in American camps during World War II. The German military, under Nazi ideology, largely restricted women to auxiliary roles rather than frontline combat positions, where capture as prisoners of war would typically occur. The few German women who did serve in military capacities were primarily Wehrmacht's Helferinnen, or female Wehrmacht helpers, working in communications, anti-aircraft operations, and medical services. When captured, these women were often classified differently than traditional prisoners of war. However, the experiences of the overwhelming majority of German prisoners of war in America, along with the limited accounts from German auxiliary personnel and civilians who found themselves in American custody, reveal a fascinating cultural collision. These encounters illuminate the stark differences between wartime living conditions in Nazi Germany and the relative abundance of the United States, even under wartime rationing. To understand the magnitude of this cultural shock, we must first journey back to the Germany these prisoners left behind. By 1943, the Third Reich was already showing cracks in its facade of invincibility. The initial lightning victories of the early war years had given way to grinding campaigns that demanded everything from the German people. In the cities of the fatherland, soap had become a precious commodity. The average German citizen received a monthly ration of just 50 grams of soap, barely enough for basic washing. Hot water was increasingly rare as fuel shortages gripped the nation. Public baths, once common in German cities, operated on severely restricted schedules. Many closed entirely, as coal and gas were diverted to the war effort. German women, whether serving as auxiliaries or working in war factories, often went days without proper washing facilities. In the cramped barracks where female auxiliaries were housed, a dozen women might share a single wash basin. Hot water was heated in communal kitchens and rationed carefully. Personal hygiene had become a luxury that few could afford in Hitler's total war economy. The contrast grew even starker in the countryside, where many auxiliary units were stationed near anti-aircraft positions or communication centers. Here, women often relied on cold streams or wells for washing. The iconic propaganda images of healthy, clean German maidens serving the fatherland bore little resemblance to the reality of wartime hygiene in the Reich. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America was gearing up for its own total war effort, but from a position of unprecedented industrial strength. Even under rationing, American hygiene standards remained remarkably high. The average American home had running water, and most had hot water heaters. Soap, while rationed, was available in quantities that would seem luxurious to German eyes. When the first German prisoners began arriving in America in early 1942, they entered a world that seemed almost fantastically abundant. The processing centers where they first encountered American hospitality told the story of two nations at very different stages of wartime sacrifice. These encounters illuminate the stark differences between wartime living conditions in Nazi Germany and the relative abundance of the United States, even under wartime rationing. It's clear that the speaker's voice contains power and authority. Their voice also has great modulation and variety, making them an engaging speaker. For men forged in the crucible of the Eastern Front, where brutality was the common currency of war, the expectation was not just hardship, but malevolence. Every story, every whispered rumor, every official pronouncement from the Reich had painted a picture of an America as vengeful and ruthless as the Soviet Union, perhaps even more insidious in its methods. They anticipated interrogation rooms filled with shadows, starvation diets designed to break the will, or perhaps even the swift, silent end of a bullet in the back of the neck, dispensed without ceremony. But the universe, as it often does, had a darkly ironic twist awaiting them. Instead, the first thing these hardened Wehrmacht veterans saw after getting off the train in Arkansas, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight, wasn't a firing squad or a torture chamber. It was a row of white porcelain showerheads gleaming under the bright June sun, and a smiling American private, his uniform crisp, holding out a fresh bar of soap. Not just any soap, mind you, but a full, fragrant bar, offered with a casual generosity that made it seem like a ticket to another planet entirely. In that precise, disorienting moment, the most feared weapon on Earth wasn't a tank or a bomb, nor was it the relentless advance of Allied armies. It was something far more insidious, far more revolutionary: hot water and perfumed lather. And it cracked their worldview wide open, exposing the fragile edifice of their beliefs to a torrent of unexpected reality. Imagine, if you will, the psyche of a 21-year-old grenadier. This isn't some fresh recruit. This is a man who has fought from the frozen hell of Stalingrad to the shattered landscapes of the Rhine. He's seen things, done things, that would haunt ordinary men for a lifetime. Every speech he'd ever heard, every propaganda poster plastered on crumbling walls, every carefully vetted Feldpost letter back home, they all hammered home the same unyielding narrative. The Americans are nothing more than barbaric gangsters. Their prison camps are death huts where men vanish. Their doctors inject poison and conduct grotesque experiments. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was the air they breathed, the truth they were forced to internalize. So, when he steps onto foreign soil, exhausted and defeated, he is utterly certain of his fate. He expects to be worked to death, mining coal or harvesting cotton under a relentless sun, until his ribs protrude like a skeletal cage. He expects indignity, suffering, and a slow, agonizing demise. Soap? That's a rumor, a distant, impossible luxury from a forgotten peacetime. Hot water? Only for the dogs, or perhaps for the sadistic pleasure of his captors. This was the psychic armor these men wore, a thick, impenetrable shell of fear and indoctrination. When the rail cars clanged shut and the ships cast off for distant, alien shores, New Jersey, Louisiana, Texas, names that sounded like fever dreams, places where only unimaginable horrors could await them. Their minds were a fortress, built brick by brick with Goebbels' lies, ready to withstand any physical torment. But what they weren't prepared for was kindness. Yet, the first thing that greets them upon arrival isn't a snarling guard or a bayonet jab. It's a Red Cross truck, painted a stark, reassuring white, and from it, an American soldier, not with a weapon, but with trays of fresh donuts. Donuts! A sweet, unexpected comfort in a world that had offered nothing but bitterness. Then, a medic approaches, not with a syringe of poison, but with a sprayer, dusting them with DDT powder to kill lice, apologizing for the inconvenience like a hotel concierge checking in a valued guest. The sheer incongruity of it all was baffling. Apologies? For lice treatment? It was a level of politeness and consideration that had been utterly absent from their wartime experience. And then comes the line. A simple, unassuming directive that every former prisoner, even 50 years later, would remember with startling clarity. Right this way for showers. Fellas, towels on the left, soaps free. Free soap. The words hung in the air, almost sacrilegious. In 1944 Germany, a family of 5 would trade precious ration coupons, sometimes even black market goods, for one meager cake of ersatz soap, barely the size of a matchbox, made from who knew what industrial byproducts. Here, in this alien land, it wasn't just available. It was stacked in glorious pyramids on a bench, a shimmering monument to abundance. Some POWs, their instincts still honed by scarcity, instinctively pocketed the bars, thinking they'd sell them later, convinced this was a temporary illusion. Others hesitated, their eyes darting around, sure it was a trap, a cruel trick designed to expose their greed or vulnerability. Propaganda, it turns out, dies hardest not in the mind, but in the nose, in the ingrained expectation of deprivation, in the very core of one's being. The scent of real soap, clean and pure, was an assault on their carefully constructed reality. They shuffled forward, a line of wary, dirty men, into the tiled room. A faint, almost forgotten scent of disinfectant mingled with something else, something clean, something almost luxurious. Then the steam. It wasn't the acrid metallic steam of a field kitchen, but a soft, enveloping mist that hinted at warmth and release. The first man, tentative, almost reverent, reached out a hand. The water was already warm. Not cold, not lukewarm, but genuinely warm. And it flowed freely. No bucket, no stove, no endless queue, no desperate rationing. Just an endless, inviting stream of warm water. He hadn't felt truly clean, he realized, not since the endless, unforgiving steppes of Ukraine had turned his skin to cracked, bleeding leather, his body coated in a permanent layer of grime, sweat, and fear. The soap, when he finally dared to use it, smelled faintly of lilacs, a delicate floral fragrance, not the harsh, industrial stench of lye and sawdust that passed for soap back home. As he rubbed it across his skin, a rich, creamy lather climbed his arms, carrying away not just ground-in dirt, but the dried blood of battles long past, the pervasive stink of horse and gun oil that had become a second skin. It was a physical and symbolic cleansing. Someone, perhaps overwhelmed by the sheer, simple luxury, laughed nervously, a sound that quickly dissolved into a choked sob. Another man, tears streaming down his face, tried to hide it under the spray, ashamed of such an open display of emotion. The American at the door, observant but non-judgmental, simply said, "Take your time, boys. Plenty for everybody." In that instant, the absolute simplest luxury, a warm, unrestricted shower, a fragrant bar of soap, became a psychological earthquake. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about dignity, about humanity. And in that moment of profound, simple comfort, a terrifying, subversive thought began to bloom in their minds. Maybe everything we were told is wrong. Maybe they are not the monsters we were led to believe. But relief, as often happens in wartime, lasts only seconds. The initial shock of comfort gives way to a deeper, more unsettling emotion. Guilt. A crushing, suffocating guilt that rises with the steam and coats their newly clean skin. Somewhere, in the bombed-out ruins of Cologne, a sister is boiling potato peels for dinner, scraping together meager sustenance for her family, her stomach aching with hunger. Somewhere in Silesia, a mother, her hands raw from endless work, is meticulously cutting up old wallpaper to patch her only dress, trying to maintain some semblance of order and dignity in a world crumbling around her. And here they stand, under a never-ending fountain of hot water, holding soap that smells like summer gardens, a scent utterly alien to the ravaged landscape of their homeland. It was an unbearable contradiction. Prisoner Wilhelm Lenz, a man whose identity was now irrevocably tied to his captivity, managed to write home, a sentiment that would resonate deeply with his comrades. "I feel like a traitor for simply being clean." The letter, like so many others, was censored, its raw honesty deemed dangerous. But the sentiment, unspoken and unwritten, spread barrack to barrack, a silent epidemic of conscience. The enemy, their sworn adversary, was treating them better than their own leaders were treating their families, better than their own regime was treating its loyal citizens. This was cognitive dissonance in its most brutal form, a profound internal conflict that smelled, ironically, of lilacs. It chipped away at their loyalty, not with threats or violence, but with the quiet, persistent drip of kindness. The very act of being clean became a betrayal, a stark reminder of the suffering they had escaped and the suffering their families endured. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States housed a staggering 378,000 German POWs. These men were spread across 501 main camps and thousands of branch work sites, a logistical feat in itself. But beyond the sheer scale, there was a deliberate strategic approach to their treatment. The U.S. was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which mandated adequate food, medical care, and hygiene for prisoners of war. And the Army, with a meticulousness that surprised many, followed these guidelines almost to the letter. This wasn't merely out of altruism. It was a calculated decision. Morale mattered, not just for the POWs, but for the war effort itself. There was a pragmatic reason. The U.S. wanted the same humane treatment for its own boys, those American soldiers and airmen who had fallen into German hands. Reciprocity was a powerful motivator. But there was also a deeper, more subtle objective. Consider the numbers. Soap consumption in these American camps averaged 0.8 ounces per prisoner per week, a quantity that was triple the meager Wehrmacht ration back in Germany. This wasn't an accident. Army engineers, masters of efficiency and resourcefulness, built boiler houses capable of heating an astonishing 6,000 gallons of water per hour, ensuring that every man could shower not just once, but twice a week. The prisoners, with their characteristic dark humor, even coined a sardonic joke that encapsulated their surreal situation. "We live like American officers and eat like American privates." This wasn't a boast. It was a reflection of a reversal of fortunes that quietly, relentlessly gnawed at the very foundations of Nazi faith. The conditions they experienced were a living refutation of everything Goebbels had preached about American decadence and cruelty. The numbers weren't just statistics. They were a testament to a policy designed to disarm, not just physically, but psychologically. Make no mistake, these showers, this seemingly mundane act of hygiene, were profoundly strategic. They were a weapon, albeit one wielded with kindness rather than violence. Interrogators quickly learned that a prisoner scrubbed clean of lice and grime, a man who felt a measure of human dignity restored, was far more willing to talk, to cooperate, to reveal information. The physical discomfort and dehumanization of war often created a defiant, closed-off mentality. But when that discomfort was alleviated, when the basic human need for cleanliness was met with generosity, the psychological barriers began to crumble. But the real victory, the profound, lasting impact, was far subtler than mere intelligence gathering. Each bar of soap, each cascade of warm water, dissolved not just dirt, but the greasy, pervasive film of propaganda that had coated their minds for years. When a man sees that his captor bothers to kill lice, those ubiquitous, dehumanizing parasites, instead of simply killing the prisoners themselves, he can't help but start asking inconvenient questions. If Americans are truly beasts, subhuman and savage, why do they hand us toothpaste, a symbol of personal care and self-respect? If they are soft, effeminate, and incapable, how did they manage to build 50,000 planes last year, a manufacturing feat that dwarfed anything the Reich could produce? These questions, once planted, ricocheted inside the skull with a force louder than any lecture, any shouted command, any Goebbels speech. They were internal detonations, shattering preconceived notions. Camp newspapers, often secretly run by anti-Nazi POWs, who saw an opportunity in this ideological vacuum, sprouted overnight, filled with dissenting voices. Enrollment in English classes, initially seen as a way to pass the time, exploded as prisoners sought to understand the language of their enemies, and, perhaps, the language of their new reality. By the war's end, an astonishing 1 in 4 prisoners signed a declaration renouncing Hitler, a testament to the profound ideological shift fostered, in part, by the simple, subversive power of soap and hot water. The enemy they had been taught to despise was proving to be, unexpectedly, human. The impact of these experiences resonated deeply, often in ways that history books, focused on grand narratives, tend to skip over. They are the tiny, unquantifiable victories, the personal transformations that speak volumes. Heinz Richter, a Panzer radio operator, his hands accustomed to the cold metal of his equipment, remembered the profound trepidation of that first shower. "I stepped into the shower expecting to be shot from behind," he recounted years later, the memory still vivid. "When nothing happened, when the water just kept flowing, warm and endless, I washed myself 3 times just to feel the water, to prove to myself it was real." I think that was the moment America won the war inside me. It wasn't a surrender to a military force. It was a surrender to an idea, to an unexpected humanity. Another prisoner, a hardened U-boat cook, a man whose life had been defined by the grim realities of submarine warfare, confessed on camera decades later, his voice still tinged with wonder. "I kept the soap wrapper as a souvenir. It said, 'Procter & Gamble, Cincinnati.' I had no idea where Cincinnati was, but it sounded like heaven." Think about that for a moment. A simple paper wrapper, a mundane commercial artifact, transformed into a precious relic, a tangible symbol of a moment of profound personal revelation. It wasn't just a souvenir of a place. It was a souvenir of a feeling, of an emotional turning point. These aren't just anecdotes. They are windows into the soul of men whose entire understanding of the world was being irrevocably altered by the most unexpected of means. The scent of a distant city, carried on a bar of soap, became the scent of hope. Meanwhile, across the vast expanse of the Atlantic, American POWs in German camps confronted a very different, far grimmer arithmetic. While German prisoners in the U.S. were discovering the unexpected luxury of continuous hot water, their American counterparts were enduring conditions that highlighted the brutal disparities of total war. At Stalag 7A, for instance, rations dipped to a horrifying 800 calories a day, a slow starvation diet designed to break the body and the will. Soap, far from being a fragrant bar of Procter & Gamble, was a sliver of rehydrated potassium carbonate, a harsh, abrasive substance that scoured skin raw, offering little comfort and even less actual cleanliness. Lice, those insidious companions of deprivation, carried typhus through cramped, overcrowded barracks, where disease spread unchecked. Water for washing was a precious, often frozen commodity, collected in basins that offered little more than icy torment. The contrast, the sheer, unimaginable chasm between these two experiences, was not lost on anyone, least of all the Reich's own prisoners. Diaries kept by bewildered German camp guards, tasked with observing the American approach to their own prisoners, record a genuine sense of bewilderment. They couldn't comprehend why the U.S. would waste valuable resources on hygiene, on comfort, on dignity, when bullets, in their estimation, were so much cheaper, so much more efficient. That strategic waste, that deliberate investment in humanity, became a louder, more compelling rebuttal to Nazi ideology than any propaganda leaflet dropped from a B-17. It wasn't just a difference in policy. It was a fundamental difference in values, a stark reflection of two opposing worldviews. Back in the sprawling network of camps scattered across Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Colorado, life for German POWs began to take on a semblance of normalcy. albeit a highly controlled one. These camps, far from being the death huts of propaganda, operated surprisingly like small towns, complete with their own internal economies and routines. Prisoners were put to work, contributing to the American war effort, picking cotton in the scorching fields, peeling potatoes in vast mess halls, or cutting timber in the dense forests. But this wasn't forced labor in the brutal sense. They were paid for their work, not in US dollars, but in scrip, a special currency valid only within the camp system. This scrip, however, represented a taste of economic freedom previously unimaginable. At the camp canteen, a veritable oasis of plenty, they could spend their earnings on real coffee, a luxury that had all but vanished from wartime Germany, on Hershey bars, a sweet indulgence, and yes, crucially, on extra bars of soap. A private's daily wage of 80 cents, earned through hard work, could buy 3 candy bars or 1 luxury-sized ivory soap, a choice that spoke volumes about their newfound priorities. Some men, driven by a profound sense of loyalty and a quiet rebellion against the regime that had brought ruin to their country, even mailed these precious bars of soap home through the Red Cross. Letters from Germany, often tear-stained, recount mothers weeping over a package that smelled faintly, wonderfully, impossibly of America, of fat, of perfume, of a world utterly distant from their bombed-out reality. These small acts of defiance, carried by the scent of soap, were powerful statements against the ideological grip of the Reich. Yet, the psychological impact of this unexpected kindness cut both ways, creating bruises that were perhaps even deeper than those inflicted by cruelty. For German officers, steeped in generations of Prussian pride, in the rigid hierarchy and unwavering discipline of the Wehrmacht, being treated civilly by the foe was not a comfort. It was an unbearable shame. To be fed, clothed, and scrubbed clean by their enemy felt less like humane treatment, and more like patronage, a humiliating act of charity that held up a brutal mirror to their own failures, to the collapse of their once mighty nation. The more humane the camp, the deeper the humiliation. Historian Arnold Kramer, who meticulously interviewed countless former prisoners, captured this paradox with a poignant quote from one of them. "We lost our dignity not through cruelty, but through kindness." This wasn't just about personal feelings. It was about the unraveling of an entire identity built on superiority. The very act of receiving such basic human consideration from those they had been taught to despise as inferior, as soft, as decadent, challenged their core beliefs. Soap, in this context, became a moral solvent, scrubbing away the illusion of Aryan superiority, dissolving the carefully constructed edifice of racial and cultural dominance, not with bullets or bombs, but with the quiet, persistent power of human decency. It was a subtle yet devastating blow to their ideological framework. Word, as it always does, spread quickly and inexorably through the camps, carried on whispers and hushed conversations. The details, initially disbelieved, then cautiously accepted, became an epidemic of comparison. Each revelation another crack in the edifice of Nazi propaganda. In Texas, they said, you could get steak on Sundays. In Mississippi, they showed movies twice a week, projecting Hollywood dreams onto a canvas of wartime reality. In New Mexico, the dentist, incredibly, offered Novocaine before drilling, a small mercy unimaginable in the brutal field hospitals of the Eastern Front. Each comparison, each whispered detail of American abundance and care, chipped away at the grand narrative of their own suffering and the enemy's supposed barbarism. German camp loudspeakers, once booming with confident pronouncements, had famously boasted, "In America, wirst du verhungern. In America, you will starve." Yet here stood 180 pounds of well-fed, healthy proof to the contrary, living refutations of Goebbels's lies. The stark reality was undeniable. Prisoners, with their characteristic gallows humor, even coined a bitter joke that perfectly encapsulated their bizarre situation. Der Russe schießt dich. Der Tommy bombardiert dich. Der Ami wäscht dich. The Russian shoots you. The Briton bombs you. The American washes you. It was a darkly humorous acknowledgement of their unexpected fate, a recognition that the American approach, while seemingly less violent, was perhaps far more insidious, far more effective in dismantling their ideological defenses. The act of being washed, of being cared for, was proving to be a more profound weapon than any conventional arm. The postal service between German POWs in America and their families back home was a tightly controlled affair. Censors, diligent and ever-present, clipped anything deemed strategic, any information that could be useful to the enemy or undermine the morale of the home front. But, in a fascinating oversight, they often let details about hygiene pass through. A phrase like, "They give us white bread every day," a simple observation of an unimaginable luxury, might slip past their watchful eyes. Multiply that by 400,000 letters per month, a staggering volume of communication, and suddenly, families in Germany, starved and struggling, began to wonder. The subtle implications were profound. Mothers, desperate for any sign of comfort for their sons, wrote back, "Save some soap for us," unaware that such savings violated camp rules, unaware of the sheer abundance that made such a request almost comical to their sons. This postal ping-pong, this seemingly innocuous exchange of domestic details, became a powerful underground information railway. It carried fragments of American abundance, whispers of an alternative reality, deep into the Reich's heartland. These seemingly trivial details, like white bread and plentiful soap, became symbols of a world beyond the grim confines of their wartime existence, subtly eroding the carefully constructed narrative of sacrifice and deprivation that the Nazi regime desperately tried to maintain. The truth, even in small doses, has a way of finding its cracks. By the winter of 1944, the Wehrmacht was in full, desperate retreat on all fronts. Its once unstoppable advance, now a crumbling, desperate rearguard action. Inside the POW barracks in America, a different kind of retreat was happening, just as decisively, just as irrevocably. Young draftees, their minds still fresh with the indoctrination of Goebbels's radio broadcasts, now found themselves in heated arguments with the true believers, the hardened Nazis who still clung to the dying embers of their ideology. And in these debates, the unlikely catalyst for ideological collapse was often something as simple, as mundane, as soap. If Americans are subhumans, one might challenge, why do they smell better than we do? The question on the surface sounds trivial, even absurd, but it strikes at the very core of the Nazi racial hierarchy, designed to dehumanize and subjugate. It unmans the entire construct of Aryan superiority. If the supposed inferior enemy practices superior hygiene, what does that say about the master race? The implications were devastating. Camp librarians, observing the intellectual ferment, reported a sudden rush on German translations of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine, texts that championed enlightenment, individual liberty, and democratic ideals, concepts utterly anathema to Nazi doctrine. Ideology, it turns out, doesn't always collapse with a bang, with the thunder of artillery or the roar of marching boots. Sometimes it collapses with the quiet, subversive squish of lather, with the gentle hiss of a shower, washing away years of carefully constructed lies. When the war finally ended, the repatriation ships that left New York, packed with German prisoners, carried a cargo of complex emotions. Many dreaded going home. Germany lay in rubble, a wasteland of bombed-out cities and shattered lives. The clean shirts, the full bellies, the simple dignity they had experienced in American captivity, these would be nothing but distant memories by the time they reached the war-torn docks of Le Havre. Yet, many carried duffel bags stuffed with care packages, a testament to the generosity they had encountered. Soap, toothpaste, coffee. These were not just personal effects. They were tangible symbols of a different world. They traded these precious goods on the black market for train tickets, for food, for a chance to rebuild. Or, in acts of profound compassion, they simply pressed them into the hands of widows, of starving children, of those who had endured the unvarnished brutality of the war on the home front. The habit of cleanliness, the appreciation for hygiene, stuck with them. Surveys conducted in the 1950s, a decade after the war, revealed a fascinating cultural shift. Former POWs bathed twice as frequently as civilians who had not been captured. It was a small but measurable change, a lasting cultural imprint born not in a classroom, but in a shower room, a silent testament to the enduring impact of their captivity. The simple act of regular bathing became a quiet revolution, a personal declaration of dignity in a world that had tried to strip them of it. The impact of their American experience wasn't confined to personal hygiene habits. It rippled outwards, influencing lives and communities in unexpected ways. Some of these former prisoners, having witnessed a different way of organizing society, returned to Germany and applied lessons learned in captivity to their post-war lives. They built businesses, citing principles of fair treatment for workers, of maintaining spotless washrooms, of sharing surplus resources, concepts that had been so alien in the rigid, hierarchical world they had left. It was a subtle, yet profound, transfer of cultural values. A few even became mayors in their devastated towns, and in quiet acts of penance, or perhaps just practical application of what they had learned, they funded public baths, ensuring their communities had access to the very luxuries that had so shocked them decades earlier. It was a quiet atonement for the savagery they had once endorsed, a tangible effort to rebuild not just infrastructure, but a sense of communal well-being. One ex-U-boat commander, Heinz Wehner, a man who had once waged war beneath the waves, emigrated to Wisconsin in 1956 and, in a poetic twist of fate, opened a soap manufacturing company. Its logo, a powerful statement of his own transformation, read simply, "Cleanse body, cleanse mind." The arc of history, it seems, bends towards unexpected paths, and sometimes it smells faintly of lavender, a scent of healing and renewal. Great wars, we are often told, are fought with steel, with tanks and bombs and bayonets. But the truth, the deeper, more uncomfortable truth, is that they are ultimately settled in the mind, in the hearts and minds of the people who fight them and endure them. The shower episode, this seemingly minor historical footnote, reminds us of a profound truth. That basic decency, that simple, unadorned human kindness, can be a sharper, more enduring blade than any bayonet, more potent than any propaganda. In an age saturated with disinformation, where enemies are demonized, caricatured, and reduced to two-dimensional villains in 280 characters or less, the story of German POWs and American soap offers a powerful counter-algorithm. It presents a radical yet simple idea. Treat people like humans long enough, with consistent, unyielding kindness, and eventually, inevitably, they will notice. They will question. They will begin to see beyond the manufactured narratives of hatred. Propaganda, that insidious weapon of control, wilts and crumbles under the steady, relentless drip of ordinary kindness, just as concrete can be eroded by persistent water. It's a lesson that transcends the battlefield, a timeless truth about the enduring power of empathy in a world too often consumed by division. If these small moments of history, these unexpected turns in the human story, fascinate you as much as they do me, then I urge you, tap that subscribe button and stick around. We delve into more untold stories, more hidden truths, more profound human experiences every single week. Don't miss out. So, what's the core of it all? What's the single undeniable truth threaded through this remarkable tale? A bar of soap didn't just wash away dirt. It washed away an entire edifice of lies, proving, with quiet, undeniable force, that the most disarming, the most profoundly revolutionary weapon is sometimes nothing more than a shower head humming hot water onto scared, exhausted men who suddenly, shockingly, realize the enemy is more human than their own myths, more compassionate than their own leaders. Next time you step into your own shower, next time you lather up with a fragrant bar of soap, take a moment. Remember the Wehrmacht veterans who, expecting death, expecting torture, stepped into an American shower and stepped out questioning everything they had ever been taught, everything they had ever believed. History, you see, doesn't always turn on grand, sweeping battles or dramatic political upheavals. Sometimes it turns on strange, quiet hinges. A faucet, a cake of soap, a moment of dignity offered when only cruelty was expected. If such simple things, such basic acts of human consideration, can redirect the course of individual lives, if they can begin to dismantle the most entrenched ideologies, then imagine what deliberate, widespread kindness could do today, in our own complex world. History doesn't always shout its lessons from the rooftops. Sometimes, often, it whispers through the scent of lilacs and the gentle hiss of steam, inviting us to listen, to learn, to remember. And if you want more stories where humanity, in all its messy, beautiful complexity, manages to sneak past the barbed wire of conflict and prejudice, hit that subscribe button. Because the past is never just the past. It's a living, breathing reminder of who we were, who we are, and, most importantly, who we can still choose to be.